Good evening. Look closely at this image. What do you see? A simple flower, delicate, almost ethereal, its petals a whisper, its colors a gentle blush against the earth. Harmless, right? A silent observer in the grand tapestry of nature? But this unassuming bloom, Papaver somniferum, the sleep-bringing poppy, has woven a darker, more devastating thread through human history than almost any other plant on Earth. For over 5,000 years, humanity has chased the fleeting embrace of its potent sap. We sought solace, healing, even divine insight. But in our relentless pursuit, we inadvertently unleashed a force that has reshaped empires, ignited wars, created generations of addicts, and continues to defy our every attempt at control. It's a story of paradox, a source of profound relief that became an instrument of unimaginable suffering, a sacred medicine transformed into a global commodity, fueling conflict and power struggles across continents and centuries. Tonight, we peel back the layers of time to confront this enduring, often destructive relationship. We'll trace the poppy's relentless march from ancient fields to modern battlefields, from humble remedies to the deadliest drugs, revealing how one flower has consistently remained beyond our grasp. Prepare for a journey that connects Neolithic farmers to Victorian mothers, Qing emperors to Wall Street financiers, and Cold War covert operations to today's devastating opioid crisis. This isn't just history. It's a chilling echo of humanity's ceaseless quest for escape and profit, a testament to the poppy's quiet, indomitable power. Before we delve into this incredible saga, take a moment to hit that like button if you appreciate these deep dives into the untold stories of our past. And if you're new here, consider subscribing and ringing that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Now, silence your distractions, take a deep breath, and let's begin. The ancient seed of solace. Imagine a world not yet tamed, where the human mind wrestled daily with raw survival. Predators lurked, hunger gnawed, and the crushing weight of pain, a broken bone, a ceaseless cough, the agony of childbirth was an inescapable reality. Sometime around 6000 BCE, in the Fertile Crescent, our distant ancestors, those pioneering farmers, encountered a particular flower pushing its delicate head through the soil. It was the opium poppy. Perhaps they observed animals grazing on its unripe seed pods, then settling into a profound, almost blissful placidity. Or maybe a curious child, drawn by its vibrant colors, tasted the bitter, milky sap that oozed from a fresh cut. However it happened, this quiet discovery was a revolution. They learned to cultivate it, selecting for the plants with the fattest pods, the ones that wept the most potent tears. With precise cuts, they'd collect the sticky latex, which, exposed to air, transformed into a dark, gummy substance, raw opium. This was a treasure more valuable than any polished stone, capable of silencing the most primal of human torments. For the Sumerians, the architects of the written word, etched on their clay tablets from around 3400 BCE, this plant was hulgil, the joy plant. It was a gift from the gods, a direct line to the divine, administered by priests during sacred rituals to open minds to divine whispers, to soothe existential dread. It was an elixir to ease the pangs of childbirth and quiet the cough of the dying. Woven into the very fabric of their society, it was both a sacred medicine and a holy sacrament. The knowledge, like the great rivers, flowed to Egypt, where the esteemed physicians of the New Kingdom, chronicling their wisdom in the Ebers Papyrus around 1550 BCE, prescribed opium with clinical precision. It bound the bowels, treated eye ailments, and, with chilling practicality, quieted the excessive crying of children. Picture a mother in ancient Thebes, her child wailing with colic, finding blessed, unnatural silence through a small dose of this potent medicine. The city itself became renowned for its Thebaicum, high-quality opium traded across the known world, packed into amphorae, loaded onto Phoenician ships, a soft power capable of easing a king's toothache or ensuring an aristocrat's sleep. Across the Aegean, in the vibrant Minoan culture of Crete, the poppy found its spiritual center. Archaeologists unearthed a terracotta goddess figurine, eyes wide and staring, her diadem crowned with 3 opium poppy capsules, unmistakable. She was the poppy goddess, a deity of sleep, dreams, and the gentle passage between worlds, embodying healing and oblivion. On the Greek mainland, its presence was more complicated, both celebrated and feared. Homer speaks of nepenthe, a mysterious drug that banished pain and sorrow, bringing forgetfulness of every evil, likely an opium-laced wine. Later, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, approached opium with physicians' caution but undeniable respect. He cataloged its practical uses as a hypnotic, narcotic, and styptic, recommending it for internal diseases and uterine ailments. Yet it retained its mystical aura, almost certainly used in the secretive Eleusinian mysteries to induce profound visions and spiritual revelations. The Greeks understood its duality, a precise medical tool and a key to unlocking perception. When Rome absorbed Greece, it absorbed its pharmacy. The Romans, masters of organization, scaled its cultivation and trade. It became a staple. The physician Galen praised it as the most powerful analgesic, a remedy for countless ailments. He perfected complex concoctions, the theriacs, sold in apothecaries across the empire. From senators to legionaries, opium eased pain, secured sleep, and offered escape. Even the Stoic philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius was a regular user. Under the Romans, the joy plant completed its first great transformation, from a sacred flower, to a physician's tool, to a common everyday commodity, a comfort for the masses, a habit for the powerful, and a business for the empire. Its journey, however, was only just beginning. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, medical knowledge scattered. But the flame was not extinguished. It was carried eastward to the rising Islamic Golden Age. In Baghdad's magnificent House of Wisdom, scholars translated, interrogated, and refined ancient texts. Islamic physicians, masters of pharmacology, subjected opium to rigorous scientific study. Al-Razi pioneered its use as an anesthetic, developing sponges soaked in opium to induce deep slumber for surgery. But it was Avicenna, whose canon of medicine defined medicine for 600 years, who provided the most sophisticated analysis. He championed its therapeutic power for pain, diarrhea, and coughs, describing it as the most potent of all sleeping aids. Yet he was also among the first to systematically document its dark side, warning of lethargy, mental impairment, respiratory suppression, death by overdose, and most presciently, its capacity for addiction, the terrible craving it could instill. His balanced observation became the gold standard, demonstrating humanity's growing understanding and yet persistent underestimation of this plant's true power. Key point 1. The dragon's breath, opium in China. While scholars refined opium science in the West, Arab traders, masters of the long-distance caravan, spread the substance itself. Opium, pressed into dark, dense cakes, became precious cargo on the legendary Silk Road. Imagine the slow sway of camel trains, bells tinkling softly across the Central Asian steppe. Their packs filled with bolts of silk, fragrant spices, and these bricks of dried poppy juice. This route carried opium to India, where the warm, fertile lands became a second home. The Mughals embraced it, not just as medicine, but as a refined luxury, a tool for contemplation and pleasure, eaten or dissolved in drinks like doda. Emperor Akbar regulated its sale, while his son, Jahangir, became a notorious addict. India became a major center of production, its immense supply and superb quality poised to extend its reach even further east, to the shores of the largest and proudest empire on earth, China. For centuries, opium in China remained a foreign curiosity, an exotic and fantastically expensive medicine imported in small quantities. Known as yapian, it was eaten, often mixed with honey or dissolved in wine. In this form, its effects were slow, the euphoria mild, and addiction, though possible, was a gradual, less compulsive process. It was a rare indulgence for the educated elite, a powerful sleeping draught for the weary scholar, posing no threat to a vast, self-sufficient empire. No one could have predicted the alchemical reaction that was about to occur, transforming this physician's panacea into a social poison of unparalleled destructive power. The catalyst for this transformation would come not from China, but from halfway around the world: tobacco. The introduction of tobacco to China by Spanish and Portuguese sailors in the late 16th century sparked a nationwide craze. When the last Ming emperor banned tobacco in 1639, a well-intentioned act of prohibition, it backfired spectacularly. The demand went underground, spurring a fateful innovation. Merchants began mixing illicit tobacco with other substances, eventually discovering that tobacco blended with opium, a concoction called modoc, was most popular, most potent, and most profitable. This was the critical turning point, the shift from eating opium to smoking it. Ingested, opium is slowly processed, only a fraction of its psychoactive compounds reaching the brain over time. Smoked, the vapor is absorbed directly into the bloodstream through the lungs, bypassing the liver, crossing the blood-brain barrier in seconds. The result was a sudden, intense, overwhelming wave of euphoria, a rush far more powerful and compelling, maximizing the drug's addictive potential, forging a neurological prison from which escape was agonizingly difficult. Modoc became a sensation. By the early 18th century, the innovation was perfected. The tobacco became an unnecessary adulterant. Devotees discovered that by preparing the raw opium into a thick, tarry paste called chandu, it could be smoked pure. This gave rise to new rituals and paraphernalia: the specialized pipe, the tiny pill of chandu heated over an oil lamp, the long, slow breaths of thick, sweet-smelling vapor. And with it, a new social institution, the opium den. These were initially calm, almost meditative establishments, where worries dissolved in a fragrant haze and time itself seemed to slow. What began as a habit of sailors soon crept up the social ladder, infecting soldiers, merchants, officials, scholars, and poets. By the mid-18th century, addiction was a visible epidemic, sapping ambition, draining coffers, and corrupting the very fabric of Chinese society. Emperor Yongzheng was the first to recognize the existential threat, banning recreational sale and opium dens in 1729. But the trade was too lucrative, the law a blunt instrument against pleasure, profit, and pervasive corruption. It drove the trade further into the shadows, creating a vast, sophisticated black market. China had a festering wound, a homegrown crisis slowly paralyzing its people. But the wound was about to be torn open. On the horizon, the sails of a new kind of trader were appearing, the British East India Company. And they were not bringing opium by the chest, but by the shipload. The quiet, creeping sickness was about to become a raging, foreign-fueled plague. The problem was silver. For decades, the British Empire had an insatiable thirst for Chinese goods: tea, silk, porcelain. But the Qing dynasty, serene and self-sufficient, wanted almost nothing in return for Britain's heavy woolen cloth or crude trinkets. For every chest of tea that landed in London, a chest of silver sailed out of Canton, an immense hemorrhage threatening the British Empire's economic stability. A solution was needed, not diplomatic, but commercial, a new product. Something the Chinese did not know they needed, but soon would not be able to live without. And there, in the fertile fields of Bengal, under the hot, hazy Indian sun, the solution was growing: acres and acres of poppies. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company became the de facto sovereign of Bengal, gaining control over prime agricultural lands perfect for poppy cultivation. A marvel of bureaucratic efficiency, the company established a complete monopoly. It wasn't a free market, it was a command economy built around a single narcotic commodity. Company agents compelled farmers to grow poppies instead of food, establishing a subtle form of debt peonage. The raw opium latex was refined into dense, cannonball-sized cakes, high-grade, reliable, exceptionally potent Patna or Mulma opium, a brand name as recognizable in Canton's dens as any English tea was in London's drawing rooms. The company, ever mindful of its public image and royal charter, maintained a careful fiction. It did not officially sell opium to China. Instead, it held grand auctions in Kolkata. Buyers, private British, American, and Parsi merchants known as country traders, purchased the opium on credit, loaded it onto their fast clipper ships, and sailed for the Chinese coast. These were the deniable middlemen, the unofficial distribution arm of the company's vast production machine. The East India Company simply produced the drug and sold it at the warehouse door. What happened next was officially not their concern. With the proceeds from these auctions, the company then bought tea in Canton, finally closing the loop. The silver was no longer flowing out of London, it was flowing out of China, into the pockets of country traders who used it to buy tea, which then generated profits for the company in London. It was a perfect, closed, and utterly devastating triangle of trade. The corporate engine was humming, and its fuel was addiction. For the Daoguang Emperor, ruling from the silent, sprawling expanse of the Forbidden City, the reports from the south were a litany of decay. The problem was no longer just economic, though the silver drain was now reversing, bleeding the empire dry and destabilizing the currency. It was moral, a spiritual sickness hollowing out his kingdom from within. From peasant to court official, even among his elite Manchu bannermen, the pipe had become master. Productivity collapsed, the social fabric frayed. Imperial edicts were toothless, easily circumvented by corrupt officials. The emperor sided with hardliners, summoning Lin Zexu, a man of unwavering moral integrity, to Canton. Lin was appointed Imperial High Commissioner, granted extraordinary powers to extinguish the opium trade by any means necessary. When Lin Zexu arrived in early 1839, he was a man on a holy mission. He first purged his own people, arresting dealers, shutting down networks, establishing clinics, and launching a brilliant public information campaign. He even wrote an eloquent letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her conscience, sovereign to sovereign. The letter, of course, was never delivered. Having cleaned his own house, Lin turned to the foreign merchants. He demanded they surrender all their opium, every last chest. When they refused, Lin acted with quiet, calculated force. He surrounded their enclave, blockaded the river, and cut off food and water. The foreign merchants, accustomed to luxury, were now prisoners. The British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot, broke the impasse, ordering all British merchants to surrender their opium with a crucial promise: the British government would cover their losses. With a single stroke, he transformed a dispute over private illegal contraband into a matter of state. A corporate liability became a national debt, a check that could only be cashed by the Royal Navy. Over 6 weeks, a staggering 20,283 chests of opium, representing over 1,200 tons and a market value of over 2 million sterling, an astronomical sum, were handed over. Lin Zexu had won. He then made a grand statement of symbolic purification. On the beach at Human, he ordered massive trenches dug, the dark, sticky opium dumped in, mixed with salt and lime, then flooded with seawater. For 23 days, the noxious slurry was stirred before being sluiced out into the South China Sea. Lin had faced down the foreign barbarians and cleansed the shores of the Celestial Kingdom. But back in London, news of the imprisonment of British subjects and the destruction of British property was spun into a narrative of national humiliation. Merchants lobbied Parliament, framing the debate not around the morality of opium, but around free trade, national honor, and the need to teach the insolent Chinese a lesson. Lord Palmerston, the Foreign Secretary, argued forcefully for war, and so an expeditionary force was dispatched. The sound they would make upon arrival was not the quiet exchange of silver for tea, but the roar of cannon fire. The First Opium War was a collision of centuries. The Qing dynasty, a massive but pre-industrial force, faced the full weight of Britain's industrial revolution: percussion-cap muskets, superior artillery, and most decisively, the steam-powered iron-hulled paddle steamer Nemesis. Its shallow draft allowed it to bypass fortifications and sail deep into Chinese heartlands. The war was a series of surgical, overwhelming strikes. The British paralyzed the empire by seizing key islands and dismantling defenses, climaxing with the capture of Zhenjiang, where the Grand Canal met the Yangtze, threatening to starve the capital. The technological gap was a chasm. The emperor had no choice but to sue for peace. Aboard HMS Cornwallis, anchored off Nanjing, the Treaty of Nanjing was dictated on August 29, 1842. It was an invoice for a war China never wanted, fought over a drug Britain insisted on selling. Each clause was a calibrated humiliation. China paid a staggering 21 million silver dollars in indemnity. A small rocky island, Hong Kong, was ceded to Britain in perpetuity. But the true genius of the treaty was the dismantling of the old Canton system. 5 new treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were thrown open to British residents and commerce, a strategic injection of foreign influence. And, most humiliatingly, the treaty introduced extraterritoriality. British subjects were exempt from Chinese law. China's own justice system was deemed insufficient. The Qing officials signed. This was the first of the unequal treaties, showing the world that the ancient, slumbering empire was vulnerable. It was a door kicked open, and soon the Americans, French, and others would come crowding through, demanding their own ports and privileges. The ink on the treaty drew a deep, lasting scar across the nation, the formal beginning of China's century of humiliation. The peace was illusory, a fragile quiet built on resentment and shame, destined not to last. For in the world of empire, an open wound is not an invitation to heal. It is an invitation to press harder. The peace was a pause. The opium trade, unmentioned in the treaty, continued and grew, flowing into the newly opened ports, a silver torrent corrupting officials and addicting millions. The scar of Nanjing festered. For some in Britain, the terms were not enough. They wanted more. A pretext arrived in October 1856, the Arrow incident, a flimsy excuse involving a Chinese-owned ship and a dubious British flag claim. This time, the British would not be alone. The French, eager for colonial prestige, joined, their pretext equally thin: the execution of a French missionary. Thus began the Second Opium War, a replay on a grander, more brutal scale. An Anglo-French force pushed north, their steam-powered gunboats and rifled muskets brushing aside the Qing's antiquated armies. The Chinese fought with desperate courage at the Taku forts, but courage was no match for technology. The road to Beijing was open. When their forces reached the outskirts of Beijing, they found their prize: the Yuan Ming Yuan, the gardens of perfect brightness, the old summer palace. A vast wonderland of pavilions, palaces, temples, and libraries, holding the most magnificent collection of art and treasures ever assembled in China, a microcosm of the empire's wealth and sophistication. What happened next was an act of organized, industrial-scale plunder. For 2 days, British and French soldiers ransacked the palace, stuffing their pockets with priceless treasures. But the looting was only the prelude. Lord Elgin, the British commander, wanted to leave a scar visible from the Forbidden City, to punish the emperor personally. On October 18, 1860, 300 British troops marched into the Yuan with torches. For 3 straight days, the magnificent wooden palaces burned. The smoke, thick and black, blotted out the sun, raining ash and embers onto Beijing. It was a profound act of cultural destruction, an attempt to erase a memory. The emperor, who had fled, was broken. The Qing court had no choice but to accept the humiliating convention of Beijing. The terms were crushing. The opium trade was now fully and officially legalized. More ports were opened, deep into the Yangtze. Christianity could be preached freely. Massive new indemnities were levied. Foreign ambassadors were permitted to reside in Beijing. The war was over. The British and French had gotten everything they wanted. But in prying China open, they had set fire to its soul. The embers of the Summer Palace would glow for a century in the Chinese consciousness, a symbol of profound humiliation, a fire that would one day be rekindled as the spirit of revolution. While the cannons blasted open China's gates, another flag became a familiar sight, the Stars and Stripes. The Americans, too, were there. Their role has often been downplayed, yet their participation in the opium trade was quiet, shrewd, and fantastically profitable. They weren't empire builders in the British mold, not yet. They were master traders, and opium was just another commodity in a global portfolio. The first American trading ship arrived in Canton in 1784. Like the British, they faced a problem. China wanted little from the West except silver. To balance the trade, the Americans found their product not in Bengal, but in the poppy fields of the Ottoman Empire, becoming the primary smugglers of high-quality Turkish opium. This trade was conducted by the most respectable and powerful merchant families of New England, the Boston Brahmins, the new nation's aristocracy. Men like Warren Delano Jr., maternal grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, made his first fortune as a senior partner in Russell and Company, whose most lucrative branch was illegal opium importation. He saw no moral conflict, considering the trade fair, honorable, and legitimate, arguing it was no more harmful than wine and spirits. His immense profits provided the foundation for generations of family influence. The Forbes, Perkins, and Lowe families, a who's who of the New England elite, were deeply entangled, their fortunes laundered by time and respectable investments into the bedrock of Bostonian society. During the First Opium War, the U.S. remained officially neutral, a convenient stance. While the Royal Navy fought, American merchants happily took over the British share of the market, selling their Turkish product to eager buyers, profiting from the war without firing a shot. But history has a way of coming full circle. The trade these Yankee merchants so skillfully exploited abroad would eventually come home. After the Opium Wars, a wave of Chinese immigrants seeking work on the transcontinental railroads financed by men like John Murray Forbes brought with them not just their labor, but the solace of the opium pipe. Opium dens appeared in San Francisco's Chinatowns. Initially seen as an exotic, contained Chinese problem, the practice inevitably seeped into the broader culture, creating fear, moral panic, and eventually America's first wave of anti-drug legislation. The dragon's breath had crossed the ocean. Yet, while the poppy bled for the coffers of empire in the East, its ghost had long haunted the West, not in a smoky den, but in a small, respectable glass bottle, laudanum. Refined by English physician Thomas Sydenham in the 17th century, it was deceptively simple: opium dissolved in alcohol. It required no prescription, sold by the penny at the chemist or grocer. Cheaper than gin, more reliable than prayer, it was the great panacea of the industrial age. For the working-class mother, a few drops quieted a screaming infant. Products like Godfrey's cordial were household names. A quiet, compliant generation was being raised on opium. but the infant mortality rate from overdose was a silent, unacknowledged catastrophe. It was also an epidemic of the respectable. In Victorian drawing rooms, laudanum was the crutch for the weaker sex, prescribed as a calming tonic for hysteria or neurasthenia. The perfect Victorian wife, placid and serene, was often a woman maintained in a state of perpetual, low-grade opiate intoxication, a chemical corset for the female mind. The literary and artistic world was saturated with it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Thomas de Quincey, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Edgar Allan Poe, a canon of 19th century literature fueled by its divine potion. De Quincey's sensational memoir, Confessions of an English Opium Eater, romanticized addiction into a Gothic journey into the sublime and terrifying. The angel in the bottle was also the artist's muse. The scale of this quiet dependency was immense. In the 1860s, England's Fens region consumed over half the country's imported opium. Average per capita consumption in Britain far exceeded even China's at its crisis height. The US was no different. Patent medicines like Black Drop were staples in every home, their opiate contents unregulated secrets. During the American Civil War, morphine, opium's primary alkaloid, isolated in 1804, was distributed so liberally that opiate addiction became known as the soldier's disease. The hypodermic syringe, invented in the 1850s, only refined the problem, allowing direct, faster, more potent effects, creating a more efficient addict. By the late 19th century, the medical community finally awoke to the crisis it had created. The placid laudanum user had become the agitated morphinist. The angel in the bottle was now a demon. Doctors, who prescribed it so freely, now desperately sought a cure for the addiction they had fostered. The stage was set for a new miracle, a scientific solution to a scientific problem. The world needed a hero. In Elberfeld, Germany, in 1897, in the humming laboratories of Friedrich Bayer and Company, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann was hard at work. His task? Find new marketable compounds. While successfully creating aspirin, another experiment targeted morphine. Bayer, like every pharmaceutical firm, chased a holy grail, a painkiller as powerful as morphine, but without its devastating side effects and addictive grip. The prevailing theory was that by modifying the morphine molecule, its negative effects could be engineered away. Hoffmann acetylated morphine, creating a new substance, diacetylmorphine. Initial tests on animals and factory workers were astonishing. It was a phenomenally effective respiratory suppressant, calming coughs with unparalleled efficacy. It also produced a sense of well-being, a warm, untroubled euphoria. Heinrich Draeser, head of Bayer's pharmacology lab, was ecstatic, believing he had found a miracle. Based on limited and flawed studies, he claimed diacetylmorphine was not only more effective than morphine, but, crucially, not addictive. In fact, he promoted it as a cure for morphine addiction itself. Patients could be switched to this new compound, then gently weaned off it with ease. The drug made its users feel powerful, uplifted, even heroic. Bayer's marketing department christened it heroin. In 1898, Bayer launched one of the most ambitious and destructive global marketing campaigns in history. Heroin was sold as a liquid syrup and in pills, advertised in medical journals worldwide. Free samples were mailed to thousands of physicians, extolling its virtues as a sedative for coughs, a treatment for asthma, bronchitis, tuberculosis, even schizophrenia. And above all, it was the safe, non-habit-forming substitute for morphine. For a few years, the world believed it. Doctors, desperate for a solution to the iatrogenic morphine crisis they had created, embraced heroin with open arms. Patients loved it. It worked, and it made them feel wonderful. But soon, disturbing reports trickled in. Doctors noticed patients prescribed heroin to cure morphine addiction were developing a new, far more ravenous dependency. Withdrawal symptoms were exponentially worse. The awful truth dawned. The two acetyl groups attached to the morphine molecule did not weaken its effects, they supercharged them. Diacetylmorphine was more fat-soluble, crossing the blood-brain barrier with incredible speed. Once in the brain, enzymes converted it back into morphine, but now delivered in a massive, instantaneous flood to the brain's opioid receptors. It was, in essence, a high-speed delivery system for morphine. Bayer had not created a cure. It had created a chemical Trojan horse. The heroic drug was simply a far more efficient, far more addictive version of the very substance it was meant to replace. By the early 1900s, the dream was over. Hospitals reported cases of heroinism. Addicts, their prescriptions cut off, turned to the black market. The angel in the bottle had been replaced by a heroin in a syringe, and the cure had become a curse of unprecedented virulence. Bayer quietly ceased production in 1913, but the damage was done. The genie was not just out of the bottle. It had been weaponized, commercialized, and distributed globally. The poppy's chemical children, laudanum, morphine, and now heroin, were running rampant. The problem was no longer confined to Shanghai's back alleys or London's parlors. It was a global plague, and it had become painfully clear that no single nation could contain it. The world slowly and reluctantly began to awaken. The catalyst came from an unlikely quarter, the United States. In 1898, after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. acquired the Philippines and inherited a Spanish colonial opium monopoly. For the American government, steeped in Protestant moralism, this was intolerable. Bishop Charles Henry Brent, an Episcopal missionary in the Philippines, witnessed firsthand opium's debilitating effects. He became a tireless crusader, arguing the U.S. had a moral obligation to ban opium and lead an international movement against the narcotics trade. His impassioned pleas found a receptive ear in President Theodore Roosevelt, who saw an opportunity to project American influence, curry favor with China, and pressure old European colonial powers like Great Britain, whose Indian opium trade was still the linchpin of the global system. It was a perfect marriage of high-minded idealism and shrewd geopolitics. In 1909, delegates from 13 nations converged on Shanghai for the Shanghai Opium Commission. It was a grand international study group, not to make laws, but to share information and establish common ground. The American delegation pushed for strong condemnation. The Chinese made a desperate appeal for help. The British, representing the world's largest opium producer, fiercely defended their right to export for medicinal purposes, a conveniently broad and profitable category. For 3 weeks, they debated statistics, distinctions between medicinal and recreational use. Despite deep divisions, it was a landmark. For the first time, major powers discussed narcotics as a shared international problem. The Commission's 9 resolutions were non-binding, but they condemned opium smoking and urged control over derivatives. Most importantly, they called for a future conference with full diplomatic powers to codify these principles. Shanghai had not solved the problem, but it had officially put it on the global agenda. The momentum carried forward. In 1912, the Hague International Opium Convention, a far more ambitious affair, sought to create the world's first international drug control treaty. Negotiations were complex, stretching over weeks, again revealing the fault line between American/Chinese prohibitionism and the commercial pragmatism of European colonial powers. The final document, signed on January 23, 1912, was a masterpiece of diplomatic compromise. It obligated nations to control raw opium production and distribution, committed them to gradual suppression of prepared opium, and, crucially, addressed the new chemical demons from Western laboratories. It called for laws to control the sale and use of medicinal opium, morphine, cocaine, and, by name, heroin, limiting their trade exclusively to medical and legitimate purposes. It established the fundamental principle that global narcotic supply was a shared international responsibility. Yet its immediate impact was limited. Ratification was slow and painful. Then, in 1914, the world plunged into darkness. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand set off the cataclysm of the First World War. International cooperation evaporated. The opium poppy, ever the opportunist, thrived in the chaos. Morphine was needed on an industrial scale for millions of wounded soldiers, creating a new generation of addicts. The world's first attempt to awaken and control the empire of the poppy had been deferred, drowned out by the sound of artillery. The laws were written, the principles established, but the long global war on drugs had barely even begun. Key point 3. The perpetual harvest, modern conflict and crisis. The great colonial empires, which had once so diligently managed the poppy's flow, were now little more than ghosts haunting their former territories. They left behind a world of new lines drawn on old maps, and in the spaces between those lines, in the vacuums of power they created, something new and wild began to grow. As the tricolor of France and the Union Jack of Britain were lowered across Indochina and Burma, the intricate systems of control they had established, the state monopolies, the licensed dens, the colonial police, all withered away. Nature, and human nature, abhors a vacuum. Into this one stepped men with guns, men with ambition, and men who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of the poppy. The great colonial empires, which had once so diligently managed the poppy's flow, were now little more than ghosts haunting their former territories. They left behind a world of new lines drawn on old maps, and in the spaces between those lines, in the vacuums of power they created, something new and wild began to grow. As the tricolor of France and the Union Jack of Britain were lowered across Indochina and Burma, the intricate systems of control they had established, the state monopolies, the licensed dens, the colonial police, all withered away. Nature, and human nature, abhors a vacuum. Into this one stepped men with guns, men with ambition, and men who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of the poppy. The stage for this new act in our long drama was a place that wasn't really a place at all, but a convergence of mountains and borders, a rugged, mist-shrouded territory where Burma, Thailand, and Laos bleed into one another. It was a cartographer's nightmare and a smuggler's dream. They would come to call it the Golden Triangle. Before World War II, this region was a modest, almost artisanal producer of opium, mostly for local consumption. But history was about to deliver a catalyst. In 1949, Mao Zedong's communists triumphed in the Chinese Civil War. A shattered portion of the nationalist Kuomintang (KMT) army, thousands of soldiers from the 93rd Division refused to surrender. They were a lost legion, an army without a country, and they fled south, over the border, and into the remote, ungoverned highlands of Burma's Shan state. For the fledgling Burmese government, they were an intractable problem. But for another, more distant power, they were an opportunity. In Washington, D.C., the Cold War was entering its chilling prime. The fall of China was seen as a catastrophic loss, and the domino theory was taking root. The CIA, in its infancy, was tasked with stopping the dominoes from falling by any means necessary. They looked at this stranded KMT army in the Shan Hills and saw a perfect proxy force, a dagger to be pointed at the soft underbelly of Red China. So, a quiet partnership was formed under a program codenamed Operation Paper. The CIA began to secretly supply the KMT remnants with weapons, ammunition, and advisors via clandestine night flights from Thailand. The plan was simple: build up this ghost army, harass the Chinese communists, and maybe, just maybe, one day, help them retake the mainland. But armies, even ghost armies, are expensive. They need food, medicine, and to pay their soldiers. The CIA's funding was a trickle, not a flood. The KMT needed a more sustainable business model. And all around them, in the hills of the Shan state, the poppy bloomed in crimson and white. The local hill tribes had been growing it for generations. The KMT commanders, hardened realists, saw the obvious solution. They weren't merchants of vice, they were pragmatists. They organized the scattered small-scale cultivation into a vertically integrated industry. They levied a poppy tax on peasant farmers, payable in raw opium. They established their own laboratories to refine the sticky brown gum into morphine base and then into high-grade No. 4 heroin, a fine white powder perfect for the international market. And most importantly, they controlled the logistics.
They organized vast mule caravans, hundreds of animals strong, guarded by heavily armed soldiers, to transport the product out of the mountains. The opium trails, once faint footpaths, became highways of contraband leading south to the porous border with Thailand. There, corrupt officials in the Thai military and police, also staunch anti-communists and therefore allies of convenience for the Americans, were happy to look the other way, for a price. The Golden Triangle was born not of ancient tradition, but of modern geopolitics. It was a narco-state forged in the crucible of the Cold War, a secret little enterprise underwritten by the War on Communism. The irony was exquisite. While America was beginning to fret about a nascent drug problem at home, its own intelligence agency was midwifing the birth of the world's largest heroin-producing syndicate. The operation was a geopolitical failure. The KMT's pinprick raids into China were easily repulsed. But it was a spectacular business success. By the late 50s, the Golden Triangle had supplanted China as the primary source of illicit opium in Asia. Then, the conflict next door in Vietnam poured gasoline on the fire. The CIA's secret war in Laos, supporting the Royal Lao government and Hmong tribesmen against the communist Pathet Lao, created an even greater demand for unconventional logistics. To service this secret war, the agency created its own private airline, a legendary outfit called Air America. Its pilots, daring and discreet, flew C-47s and Pilatus Porters into dirt strips carved out of the jungle, delivering rice and rifles to anti-communist allies. On the return flights, the planes were often empty, but cargo space, like a power vacuum, rarely stays empty for long. The planes that brought in the tools of war often flew out with the raw materials of the drug trade. Opium from Hmong poppy fields in the mountains of Laos found its way onto Air America planes, which flew it to collection points, including the CIA's own headquarters in northern Laos. From there, it fed into the same networks run by KMT remnants and corrupt officials. The logic was inescapable. The Hmong needed money to buy food, to survive, to fight. The poppy was their only cash crop. To keep them as allies, you had to accept their business. The war on communism took precedence over any other consideration. This fertile chaos allowed powerful new players to emerge, none more formidable than a man named Chang Yi-fu, known to the world as Kun Sa.
Of mixed Chinese and Shan heritage, he built his own private army, the Shan United Army, ostensibly for independence, but in reality to build a drug empire. At the height of his power in the 1970s and 80s, Kun Sa controlled an estimated 70% of the heroin flowing out of the Golden Triangle. He gave interviews, portraying himself as a freedom fighter, even offering to sell the entire US government his yearly opium harvest to keep it off American streets. Washington declined. By the time American soldiers were fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, the Golden Triangle's heroin had begun to follow them there. Potent No. 4 heroin, 95% pure, was so cheap and plentiful in Saigon that GIs could buy it for a few dollars a vial. Addiction rates skyrocketed among the troops. The war had come full circle. The secret operations designed to contain communism in Southeast Asia had cultivated a product that was now incapacitating the very soldiers sent to fight for that cause. The dragon had begun to eat its own tail. The Golden Triangle was the poppy's new kingdom, a shadowy, mountainous realm built on Cold War paranoia,
fueled by covert operations and destined to poison the world for decades to come. But kingdoms rise and fall. As the 80s wore on, the Golden Triangle began to lose its luster. A concerted crackdown by the Thai government, under US pressure, began to close crucial smuggling routes. The Burmese military launched new offensives. Production didn't stop, but logistics became more difficult. And just as one door began to close for the poppy, another one, halfway across the world, was about to be kicked wide open. The flower is patient. It knows how to migrate. It simply waits for the right soil, the right climate, and the right kind of human chaos. It found all three in the high, desolate plains and jagged mountains of Afghanistan. For centuries, Afghanistan had been a minor character in our story, a small-time cultivator for regional markets. It was a rugged, fiercely independent land, a crossroads of empires rarely successfully conquered or governed. This very ungovernability made it perfect. The story of its ascent begins, as it so often does, with an invasion. On Christmas Eve 1979, the Soviet Union rolled its tanks across the Amu Darya River to prop up a failing communist government in Kabul. They thought it would be a short, sharp affair. Instead, they walked into a decade-long nightmare.
The Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen, rose up in a holy war against the godless Soviet invaders. And once again, Washington saw an opportunity to bleed its Cold War rival. Through Operation Cyclone, the CIA began one of the largest and most expensive covert operations in its history, funneling billions of dollars in weapons through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI. The ISI, in turn, chose which Mujahideen commanders would receive the Stinger missiles and AK-47s. To fight a war, these commanders needed more than just guns. They needed cash to feed their fighters, buy intelligence, and purchase supplies. The CIA provided weapons, but not a payroll. The poppy provided the payroll. The conditions were perfect. Decades of low-level development under the Afghan monarchy had created basic networks of roads and irrigation systems, particularly in the fertile Helmand River Valley. The war destroyed the country's legitimate economy, but left this infrastructure largely intact. Farmers who once grew wheat or pomegranates could no longer get their crops to market. But opium was different. It didn't need refrigeration. It wasn't bulky. A local trader, often connected to a Mujahideen commander, would come directly to the farm, pay in cash, and take the raw opium gum away. It was the ultimate wartime cash crop. The commanders encouraged its cultivation, taxed it, and protected the smuggling routes. The labs that cooked the opium into heroin sprang up in the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan, often under the protection of the same ISI agents distributing the CIA's weapons. The heroin flowed out along the same route the weapons flowed in. The Khyber Pass became a two-way street. The scale of the transformation was breathtaking. In 1979, Afghanistan produced perhaps 100 tons of opium a year. By the end of the Soviet occupation a decade later, it was producing thousands of tons. It had become the undisputed global leader, the Saudi Arabia of opium, leaving the Golden Triangle far behind. The war against the Soviets was won, but the price of that victory was the creation of a narco-state. The infrastructure of jihad had merged perfectly with the infrastructure of drug trafficking. When the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the chaos did not end. The victorious Mujahideen factions turned on one another in a vicious civil war. Warlords carved out fiefdoms, and their primary source of income was invariably the poppy. Amid this anarchy, a new force emerged from the religious schools, the madrasas of southern Afghanistan and Pakistan, the Taliban, the students. They were austere, pious, and utterly ruthless. They promised to replace the chaos of the warlords with the purity of Islamic law, sweeping across the country with shocking speed. The Taliban's relationship with the poppy was a masterpiece of cynical pragmatism. They declared it haram, forbidden by Islam, but they did not eradicate it. Instead, they perfected the system of taxation.
They introduced a 10% Islamic tax, or ushur, on the opium harvest. It was efficient, it was lucrative, and it funded their war machine, allowing them to conquer nearly 90% of the country. They became the world's first and only drug cartel to also run a government. Then, in July of 2000, in a bid for international legitimacy and aid, their leader, Mullah Omar, did something extraordinary. He issued an edict from on high, a decree backed by the full brutal force of his regime, banning all poppy cultivation. And because the Taliban's control was absolute, it worked. In a single season, they wiped out the world's largest opium crop. Production in Afghanistan fell by over 90%. The United Nations Drug Control Office verified it from satellite photos. It was the most successful counter-narcotics effort in human history. It also caused a global heroin drought and panic among the world's addicts. This strange, quiet period lasted just over a year. On September 11, 2001, 2 planes struck the World Trade Center in New York. The Taliban's guests, Al-Qaeda, had declared war on the United States. Weeks later, American bombs began to fall on Afghanistan. The Taliban regime crumbled. In the power vacuum that followed, the warlords America allied with to overthrow them, the very same Mujahideen commanders from the 1980s, promptly went back into the only business they knew. The poppy fields bloomed again with a vengeance. Under the watch of US and NATO forces, poppy cultivation in Afghanistan exploded to levels never before seen. The reasons were complex and tragic. The coalition's primary mission was fighting the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, not eradicating poppies. To destroy a farmer's only source of income was to create a new enemy, to push him directly into the arms of the resurgent Taliban. The Taliban, now the insurgents, also returned to the opium trade. It was the perfect way to fund their war against the new foreign invaders. The poppy paid for the IEDs that killed American and British soldiers. It paid for the rifles, the rockets, and the suicide vests. The hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the war on terror were pitted against an insurgency funded by the very drug that was creating a public health crisis back in the West. It was a perfect, self-sustaining circle of violence and addiction. A war feeding a drug trade that in turn fed the war. The poppy was no longer just a cash crop. It was a strategic weapon, the lifeblood of the longest war in American history. The fields of Helmand and Kandahar were not just agricultural land, they were battlefields watered with blood and blooming with a terrible, perpetual harvest. This vast, unstoppable river of opium flowing from the mountains of Central Asia had to go somewhere. It snaked its way along ancient smuggling corridors. The Balkan route through Iran and Turkey into Europe. The northern route through the former Soviet republics to Russia. The old Silk Road, now paved with heroin, into China. It fed the habits of millions, a global enterprise of breathtaking scale and efficiency. But as the 21st century dawned, this ancient plant-based trade was about to collide with a new and strangely parallel crisis, one born not in a dusty field, but in a sterile laboratory. The poppy's oldest promise, the relief of pain, was about to be reborn in a modern, deceptively safe-looking form, and it would create a new geography of despair, far from the battlefields of Afghanistan. The story begins in the United States, in the corporate offices of a pharmaceutical company called Purdue Pharma, owned by the Sackler family. For decades, strong opioids like morphine and oxycodone had been used in medicine, but their use was heavily restricted, reserved mostly for acute post-surgical pain and end-of-life cancer care. The medical establishment understood, from over a century of bitter experience, that they were powerfully addictive. The Sacklers, however, saw not a danger, but a vast, untapped market, the immense population of people suffering from chronic non-cancer pain, from bad backs to arthritis. The challenge was to convince doctors that a powerful opioid could be prescribed safely for long periods for everyday ailments. In 1996, they launched their weapon, a pill called OxyContin, a formulation of pure oxycodone in a clever time-release mechanism. The company's marketing campaign for this new drug was one of the most aggressive and tragically successful in history. They funded thousands of pain management seminars for doctors. They produced slick promotional videos and literature, and they pushed a single revolutionary and deeply misleading claim that because of its time-release formula, the risk of addiction from OxyContin was less than 1%. They took the terrifying, unpredictable power of the poppy and packaged it in a clean, clinical, doctor-approved pill. They even helped promote a new, compassionate-sounding idea throughout the medical community, that pain is the fifth vital sign, something that should be treated as aggressively as blood pressure or heart rate. It worked beyond their wildest dreams. Doctors, assured the risk was negligible, began prescribing OxyContin for an ever-expanding list of conditions. Prescriptions soared. Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family made billions upon billions of dollars. A generation of patients, trusting their doctors, were put on a steady, daily diet of a narcotic more powerful than street heroin. They weren't back-alley junkies. They were factory workers, farmers, housewives, high school athletes. They were simply treating their pain. But the less than 1% claim was a catastrophic falsehood. The time-release mechanism could be easily defeated by crushing or chewing the pill, delivering the full potent dose at once. And even when taken as prescribed, many more than 1% found themselves inexorably dependent. They developed a tolerance, needing more and more of the drug to achieve the same effect, to simply feel normal, to stave off the horrors of withdrawal. An entire nation was being systematically addicted, not by street dealers, but by its own healthcare system.
Then came the inevitable crackdown. As overdose deaths mounted into the tens of thousands and the truth about OxyContin's addictive potential became undeniable, authorities began to tighten the rules. States created prescription monitoring programs. Doctors became terrified of being prosecuted and began cutting their patients off. The supply of pills, which had once seemed endless, suddenly dried up. And here, our two stories, the ancient and the modern, converge in a final terrible synthesis. What happens to a person whose body and brain have been rewired by years of high-dose prescription opioids when their prescription runs out? They get sick, desperately sick, and they seek relief. On the streets, another product was waiting for them, a product that was suddenly cheaper and far more available than a bottle of illicit OxyContin pills. It was heroin. And thanks to the poppy's perpetual harvest in far-off Afghanistan, the American market was flooded with it. The very people who would never have dreamed of trying street drugs, who started their journey with a legitimate prescription from a trusted doctor, now found themselves meeting a dealer in a parking lot. They learned to cook the brown powder in a spoon and find a vein. The demographics of heroin addiction in America changed overnight. It was no longer confined to the inner cities. It moved into the suburbs, into the small towns of the Rust Belt and Appalachia, the very heartland of the country. The Afghan farmer tending his poppies in Helmand and the laid-off factory worker in Ohio were now connected. Two distant, unwitting nodes in the same global network of pain. And the poppy had one last cruel trick up its sleeve. As authorities cracked down on heroin, traffickers began to mix it or replace it entirely with something even more potent and dangerous: synthetic opioids like fentanyl, manufactured in illicit labs primarily in China and Mexico. Fentanyl is 50 to 100 times more powerful than morphine. A few grains the size of salt crystals can be a lethal dose. This was the poppy's power, distilled to its chemical essence, completely divorced from the plant itself. And it sent overdose deaths into a terrifying new orbit. So, our long, dark odyssey concludes here, in the present day, with this dual crisis. The poppy's legacy is a complex tapestry of relief and ruin. It is the Afghan farmer,
trapped between the Taliban and the government, for whom the flower is the only hope of feeding his family. It is the pharmaceutical executive whose pursuit of profit created a generation of addicts. It is the suburban parent grieving a child lost to an overdose that began with a sports injury and a prescription pad. For 5,000 years, we have sought to harness the power of this simple flower, to capture its gift of blissful oblivion. We have built empires on it, and we have fought wars over it. We have synthesized its magic into pills, and we have refined its essence into powders. Yet, we have never truly controlled it. The poppy stands as a silent testament to our human frailties, our desperate need for solace, our insatiable greed, our blind ambition. It shows us how easily a blessing can become a curse, how quickly profit can eclipse morality, and how profoundly intertwined our destinies are across cultures and continents. After all this time, all this history, all this pain, the poppy continues its quiet, patient harvest, and we are still counting the cost. If this journey through the shadowed history of the poppy has enlightened you, please consider giving this video a like, share it with someone who you think would find it thought-provoking. And if you want to continue exploring the hidden forces that shape our world, hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.